Hello, welcome to today's lesson recording. We're going to cover lesson 2.02, the immigrant experience. And today's lesson covers pages 529 to 537 in your textbook. And our goals for today, we want to summarize nativist arguments against immigrants and immigration. We also want to describe the experience of immigrants at major ports of entry, trace the effects of the Americanization movement, and describe common elements of assimilation for most immigrants. So, where did most immigrants take first step on American soil? You may have heard of kind of the most popular place that we're going to mention here in a second. It was an immigration center, and if you said this place, that is Ellis Island, which is just off the coast of New York City, and it processed more than 10 million Americans. So for number one on your reading guide, there were three major ports of entry or immigration centers that immigrants first arrived in America. The first one was Castle Garden, which was in New York City, which was the first official immigration center. Then Ellis Island, that was kind of the one that processed the most. And then Angel Island was on the other coast. This was in San Francisco on the Pacific coast. And the main immigrants that were processed through Angel Island were Asian immigrants. It kind of makes sense if you think of the geography of the world. Asian immigrants are going to be coming mostly to the west coast of the United States, and European immigrants are going to be mostly coming to the east coast just because, geography. And so the immigrants' experience differed widely depending on which side of the country that they entered. So here's a picture of an immigrant mother and her children arriving at Ellis Island in New York. And here is a picture of Japanese women arriving in San Francisco. So we're going to talk about some of those major differences that we saw between the two different ports of entry. So for number two on your reading guide, and if this video goes too fast, the beautiful thing about it being a video is that you can pause it so that you can fill out your reading guide. So just keep that in mind as I go through. So at Ellis Island, again, it was off the coast of New York City, and families who were mostly European would be processed along with thousands of other people. They would be interviewed and would have to give information about themselves. They would receive a thorough physical exam. Sometimes their names would be shortened to make them easier to spell. So, if a lot of different European names are can be difficult for to pronounce if you're not familiar with that language. So a lot of those names would be shortened. Most of the time, they left. Those immigrants that were arriving would leave Ellis Island the same day they arrived. So they would come in. It would be processed, and then they would be good to go. Angel Island was quite different. So this is the one that's San Francisco. This is the one that's processing mostly Asian immigrants. So fill in the blanks for number three here. The experience for Asian immigrants at Angel Island was different from that of European immigrants at Ellis Island. They were far less welcome, the Asian immigrants, because of widespread bias against Chinese and Japanese citizens. The staff at Angel Island would seek to reject as many potential immigrants as possible, and most of them had to remain there for 2 to 3 weeks, and many were turned back. So, think about that difference that we just talked about with Ellis Island. Most immigrants were processed a couple hours, same day, and then they were released, and they were, American citizens now. You could be at Angel Island for 2 to 3 weeks before you were processed and allowed to enter the country, or you could be turned back as well. So, and again, that was because there was a widespread bias against Asian people at the time, specifically Chinese and Japanese people. So why were these people, all these immigrants, looking to come to America? And this we talked about in 2.01, but just to reiterate, there was a lot of work a lot of new industries, jobs, even farming jobs. There was cheap land to be had. If you think the West is still being you know settled largely, and also for religious tolerance. So do any of these factors sound familiar? In Unit 1, we discussed that many people moved west in the late 1800s for some of those same reasons: new opportunities and the availability of cheap land. And one of the things that we'll talk about throughout, anytime we talk about any type of major mass migrations, one of the main reasons for that is for economic opportunities and the hope for a better life. You know, when we talk about the Great Migration with African Americans moving from the south to the north, right? One of the main reasons for that was for better economic opportunities. There were other reasons as well, but that was one of the main reasons. One of the main reasons people moved out west, economic reasons. One of the main reasons European immigrants came to the United States, economic opportunities. Same with Asian immigrants to the United States. So that's always one of the top reasons. New and better economic opportunities. And why did people leave their homelands? There could several different factors. Could have been famine in their homelands, the decline of small farms in their country, and or their homeland was in political upheaval. So many immigrants were eager to embrace the culture of their new country, but also wanted to keep some of their old culture as well. So you can still see many examples of this today, and that's what helps make the United States a diverse country. Another thing that helped the immigrants to adapt in their new country was that they were often settled in areas with other immigrants from their native countries. So that would make them more comfortable. Again, that's something that we talked about yesterday in class, right? Is that a lot of times you would have, if you would have a large group of, say, Irish immigrants, and they would all kind of settle in the same area, and they would maintain a lot of their original culture. If you had a lot of German immigrants, they would try to and tend to settle in the same areas, and then a lot of times in those areas and communities, they would still speak German as their main language. So this is kind of showcased. This was an example given in the book that uh, of a Jewish newspaper in New York that helped immigrants assimilate into mainstream American culture. So remember that term, assimilate. We're going to come to that later. Um, so that this one particular newspaper regularly printed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and it carried a regular advice column which counseled immigrants on how to adapt to American norms. So they were doing that newspaper in particular. It was a Jewish newspaper. They were doing their part to help other Jewish immigrants adapt to American culture. Immigrants tended to hold tightly to their culture from their native countries, and they often spoke the language from their native country. Sometimes they would learn, they would all have to learn at least a little bit of English, but a lot of time they wanted to hold on to that native tongue, right? That native language. Their children, however, were much more likely to embrace American culture. They would often speak English first and only their native language at home. So, when they would go to school, they would speak English. When they would be, out and about, they would speak English. But with their parents at home, who largely only spoke their native tongue, that's when they would speak their native language. And so this is going to lead to what we call a generation gap. This generation gap grew between immigrant parents and their children. The children would feel that the parents didn't understand how things really were, how things in America really were, and the parents felt that the children didn't respect the native culture the way that they should. And you can kind of imagine that parents were coming from their home country, and they had a great love and respect for that home country. The children were being born in the United States, so they didn't. They might hear stories of their home country, but those children were American born, so they didn't have the same understanding of those traditions and that culture the way that their parents did, and that's pretty obvious how that could kind of happen. So for number five, some of the ways that this generation gap grew, American-born children of immigrants had no direct connection to the old country. They usually spoke English from childhood. They dressed in American fashion. They rejected old world customs, especially in regard to dating and marriage, which could be very, very different depending on what country they were coming from. And immigrant parents often spoke broken English. Like I said, the immigrant parents would generally learn, just enough English to get them by, and would largely speak their native tongue. And they clung more strongly to those old world ways. So with all this immigration, right? One of the things that came up in the 2.01 lesson was that I think it was between 1820 and 1920, 32 million immigrants came to the United States. That's a really large number, right? Um, so immigrants were not always welcome to this new country by those who were already here. Um, and some nativists believe that the native born Americans, not referring to Native Americans, but let's say a second generation. So if you think, we talked about the first wave and second wave of immigration, right? That first wave of immigration, most of those immigrants were from Northern and Western Europe. So if you had, say, a child of those immigrants, that they were American born, um, second generation, right? So when they would grow up and see maybe people from this second wave of immigrants coming in, they felt superior to those new immigrants. They felt that some people reacted negatively, even though they were, you know, in a lot of cases, the children of immigrants themselves. So for number six here, German and Irish immigrants met with a very strong nativist reaction, and a lot of it had to do with religion. Protestants thought that Catholics' religious beliefs were incompatible with a democratic country. A lot of German and Irish immigrants were Catholic. Most of the people that were in the United States at this time were not Catholic, different sects of religions, but Protestants was a large one. Um, Working men feared that these new foreigners would take away their jobs. And where have you heard that before, right? It's something that we hear to this day when we talk about the issue of immigration. One of the main reason that people might be against immigration is because they're afraid of that loss of jobs to those immigrants. So that's something that many, 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 many years later is still an issue. All right, and we've got this chart to fill out for number seven. Um, so we have the nativist responses, and over here on the left we have Irish immigrants. Um, Many native-born Americans viewed the Irish as less than white because many Irish immigrants in the North performed the same menial jobs as free blacks, and because they were generally poor and disadvantaged. So, Irish immigrants, for anybody that was not was non-Irish, they were largely denigrated and looked down upon for those reasons. Chinese immigrants over here on the right. Again, going back to what we said about Angel Island, right? There is a large spread bias against Chinese people and Japanese people. So Chinese immigrants had it tough. They were seen as an inferior and non-Christian race. Native-born Americans thought that they would take away their jobs. They were driven from mines, beaten, and threatened. And Congress actually passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a piece of legislation that basically made it almost impossible for immigrants from China to come to the United States. And like I said, I'm gonna keep cycling through these slides. Pause this video as you need, so that you can fill in your reading guide. By 1907, there was such a strong nativist reaction that President Theodore Roosevelt asked for a committee to investigate immigration and the opposition to it. A 9-person panel was led by this guy, Senator William P. Dillingham. And in his report, the Dillingham Report, they observed what we had already learned. There were 2 waves of immigration. The first wave were mostly northern European, and the second wave was largely from southern and eastern Europe. The report also had some very large racial undertones describing the immigrants from these different regions, and asked if perhaps there should be limits on certain groups of immigrants entering the United States. So those people that were largely from the first wave of immigration from Northern and Western Europe, they tended to look down upon immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. They thought they felt superior to them. They thought they were less intelligent, things like that. So there was a widespread bias against those immigrants. All right, so Congress response to immigration here. We're going to fill out this chart for number 8. So that committee was formed that we just talked about, the Dillingham Commission. It was recommended by President Theodore Roosevelt, and it was authorized by Congress. And what did the commission find? That immigrants prior to the 1880s were from the most progressive sections of Europe. Since the 1880s, immigrants were from the less progressive and advanced countries. The report claimed that as a class, these immigrants were far less intelligent than the earlier ones and lacked a family life, and suggested that some races were not fit for American citizenship. So again, some very biased findings here. So what was the result? How did the report affect public opinion? It helped prepare public opinion to support new laws, and in 1920 and 1924 that would bring an end to the century of immigration. So we really start to see after 1920 and 1924 immigration start to fall off. That 32 million number from 1820 to 1920 we're going to start to see dwindle after that time period. All right, some key terms to remember for number 9 here is melting pot, cultural pluralism, and assimilation. Melting pot is a concept of an America in which immigrant groups would meld together with native-born Americans to form a stronger American population where everyone was the same. So the idea that everybody would kind of, if you think of a stew, right? You throw in some meat, some potatoes, some carrots. Whatever else, some onions maybe, all these different things, and it all makes, one finished product, which is a stew, right? All different pieces creating one part. The idea of cultural pluralism then is the concept that the sum of America is stronger than its parts, and that immigrants could coexist alongside native-born Americans and retain their distinct cultures and traditions. So this is more for maintaining those immigrants, maintaining their native culture, while also being able to exist and be American as well. And lastly, we have assimilation, which is the concept of abandoning your birth culture and taking on a whole new culture. So that would be if an Irish immigrant comes to the United States. Let's say a German immigrant, since they speak a different language. So a German immigrant comes to the United States, gives up speaking their foreign language, only speaks English, drops all of their customs, and only considers themselves American. That would be the idea of assimilation. Okay, number 10 here, some things to think about. So in 1790, this was the very first immigration law that was passed, and this was where free white persons who had been in the country for 2 years could be naturalized or made into citizens. In 1792, the second immigration law increased the period of residency to 5 years. So basically, just took this law and instead of 2 years, made it 5 years, but you could become a naturalized citizen after you had been here for 5 years. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed where it said all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. All children born in the United States to immigrants are automatically citizens. So this helped American-born children of Chinese immigrants. So again, even if their parents were not American citizens, but the child was born here in the United States, they would be considered an American citizen. In 1885, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and it made it all but impossible for additional Chinese immigrants to come to the United States. In 1892, Ellis Island opened, and the federal government took over the job of processing incoming immigrants. And in 1920 and 1924, quotas were set on immigration, and this sharply restricted the number of Southern and Eastern European immigrants that could come to the United States and effectively closed America to immigration for a time. So make sure you fill this chart out. All right, so one of the big movements at this time was called the Americanization movement. And in the late 19th century, the flood of immigrants to America worried a lot of people. Again, that nativist response and reaction, right? Some feared that the newcomers' the newcomers' religions, some feared their customs, some feared that they spoke a different language, and others were concerned that they were going to take their jobs. And many wanted immigrants to assimilate or blend in as quickly as possible, and this is kind of what we know as the Americanization movement. So how were immigrants Americanized? Most who embraced immigration believed that immigrants should be Americanized as quickly as possible after their arrival. Federal, state, and local governments established programs to educate immigrants about how to be American. Business leaders set up Americanization classes for their immigrant workers, and educators supported this Americanization movement, as did social reformers and much of the public. Here we see a picture of these are Chinese students, and they're holding up placards giving his or her Chinese name and then their Americanized name to be entered upon the official school records. So basically, you can see here this girl's name was Americanized and changed to Anita. This girl's name, she became Grace. This little boy became Warren. This little boy Robert, and so on and so forth, right? And that was very prevalent in schools at this time. Number 11 here are these different boxes to fill out about about different responses to immigration. Nativist response was that they wanted Congress to pass laws limiting or banning most immigration because they feared the loss of American culture as people with different languages and religions entered the country. So again, nativists were very anti-immigrant and anti-immigration. The next box to fill out is about state and local governments. State and local governments actually established programs to educate immigrants to be Americans. There'd be like citizenship classes where they would learn things like the Constitution, learn how to speak English, and things like that. Business leaders would set up Americanization classes for their immigrant workers, again to help them be, teach them about American customs and the language and the Constitution and so on and so forth. This lady right here, her name is Jane Addams, and she founded Hull House, which was a settlement house in Chicago, where immigrants could learn English and job skills. She did a lot with immigrant women to teach them, American culture as well as with children. This lady is Frances Keller. She devoted her life to educating immigrants in the ways of American culture and was also one of the first American women to earn a law degree. How cool is that? All right, and since we're not live, this would normally be something I would let you do on the whiteboard, but we're not live here. So, again, just reiterating, these are important terms to understand. Cultural pluralism, even if I can't say it, melting pot, and assimilation. Make sure we understand the the differences between those ideas. All right, so there are arguments for and arguments against Americanization. We're going to go through those real quickly. So some of the arguments for it was that it would maintain American culture and heritage, and that Americanization would encourage the loyalty of immigrants. One of the things that people feared about immigrants was that they would be more loyal to their home country than they were to the United States, and they felt that Americanization would encourage American loyalty over their home country. Also, adopting American ways of speaking, dressing, etc., would improve the immigrants' quality of life, and that students would have an easier time in school, and relations between workers and immigrant employees would be more fluid. Some of the arguments against Americanization: children often had to give up the religious and cultural traditions of their parents. Sometimes the process of assimilation was pushed on cultures with existing biases against them. So, for example, there was a bias against Asian immigrants. The goal of assimilation in many areas in the West, where a lot of those Asian immigrants settled, was to completely strip Asian immigrants of their culture. So that's a large argument against Americanization. So how did immigrants respond to the Americanization movement? In some cities, immigrants embraced the movement and helped establish adult education programs to teach English and U.S. history and civics. But there was also concerns about it. Like we mentioned, children of immigrant families giving up their religions and cultural traditions of their parents, and Catholic immigrants objected to the focus on the Protestant religion found in public schools at the time. In a country that freedom of religion, that First Amendment right, Catholics opposed that a lot of the education program was more focused on Protestant religion. All right, so that's the lesson. So the 2.02 checkpoint. Nativist responses to immigration and immigrants included all of the following except for which of these? Mob violence towards immigrants, the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Dillingham Report, or the 14th Amendment. And if you said the 14th Amendment, you would be correct. How did the experience of most Asian immigrants at Angel Island differ from that of Europeans at Ellis Island? It took longer and they were treated poorly, reflecting the widespread bias against Asians. It was very similar, although it did take longer. It was easier and quicker as Asian immigrants were generally more well liked, or it was very similar. And if you said here that it took longer, they were treated poorly, which reflected the widespread bias against Asians, that is the correct response. And lastly, which of the following best describes the goal of the Americanization movement? A, to aid immigrants in maintaining their birth language and cultures. B, to aid immigrants in assimilating into or becoming part of American society. C, to pass laws limiting or banning most immigration into the United States. Or D, help immigrants in learning the American culture to take back to their native country. And this one here is to aid immigrants in assimilating into or becoming part of American society. All right, that is our lesson. So we'll see you guys in class on Monday morning at 8:30. Thanks for watching this video, and make sure that you complete all the items in the 2.02 checklist and complete the checkpoint, and have a great day.